So it's important to establish the fact that the kind of philosophy we do depends on the sort of world we live in. And I want to do that. I want to offer some basics of philosophy that are appropriate to our world. So that's a side effect of pointing to the differences between Marx and Hegel being located in the different worlds they lived in, a mere 25 to 50 years apart. Okay, I'll make a start now. The question, what is the subject matter of the logic, should be rephrased as, what is Hegel's logic the logic of? If Hegel's logic is a logic, then there must be some field in which its validity can be tested. Otherwise, it is just subjective dreaming or some art form. Take, for example, formal logic. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, and so on. Formal logic is the logic of propositions. That is, the logic of deriving valid propositions from given premises. In general, we learn this in our early years at school when we learn to argue by giving reasons for what we believe. Or to put it another way, it's the rules by means of which we formulate propositions which can stand up to critique. Logic is not rhetoric or psychology. People say all sorts of stupid things in trying to justify themselves, but logic expresses what is necessary in arguing from premises if your conclusions are to withstand critique. Also, it turns out formal logic is based on a formal conception of the concepts referred to in propositions. We'll have to come back to that later. But Hegel's logic is something quite different. One of the features that many people observe when they study Hegel's logic is that somehow Hegel has introduced movement into logic. This observation raises the question of what it is that moves in Hegel's logic. If it is the concepts which move, then what the hell does that mean? In what space do concepts move? To illustrate this problem, I will briefly cite the words of Stephen Houlgate, who is a well-known English Hegelian who endeavours to present a modern interpretation of the logic which is true to Hegel's original intent. In attempting to describe the movement exhibited in the logic, he writes in the following terms. At the beginning of Hegel's logic, thought thinks, or tries to think, the utter indeterminacy of being. But that thought is so utterly indeterminate that it evaporates in the very attempt to conceive it. The thought of pure indeterminate being thus slides into the thought of nothing because of its sheer indeterminacy. In Hegel's logic, thought leads itself from pure indeterminacy to the thought of bare indeterminacy. This is the process whereby, without taking anything for granted, thought freely determines the manner in which all determinacy, at least initially, is to be thought, and so on. You see what I mean? Houlgate sees Hegel's logic as the logic of the stream of consciousness which a rational person experiences once they think about being. And what is more, this necessity, he claims, will lead the thinker through the entire series of 204 concepts in the science of logic. Further, Houlgate claims that any rational person can experience this movement, provided they open themselves to the self-movement of thoughts. Insofar as there's any truth in this at all, it is also wrong. As the logic unfolds, understanding the concepts and their progression demands insight, derived from the study of philosophy and plain life experience. All that aside, can we accept that Hegel's logic is the logic of subjective thought forms of streams of consciousness? I ask you, if Hegel's logic is the logic of subjective dreaming, what is the basis for transferring the logic to the sciences? In what sense was Marx using the logic in the writing of Capital? And what on earth is the relevance of Hegel's logic to the social sciences or anything else? In any case, believe me, thinking of, say, becoming does not force anyone to think of determinate being, or Dasein in German. This insight was the product of a person with broad life experience and an encyclopedic knowledge of the philosophy and sciences up until his own time, and no one has tried to rewrite or update the signs of logic since. Another point about Holgate's reading of the logic. Holgate says that the logic is presuppositionless, and he is repeating Hegel's words here. It means that Hegel does not claim a set of axioms or clear ideas as premises for his philosophy. If you were to set up from some axioms, then you would have to answer, where did these axioms come from? And this leads to an infinite regress. Holgate hangs quite a lot on this claim, but Hegel did not only say that the logic had to be presuppositionless, he also said there is nothing in heaven, in nature, or in the mind, or anywhere else which does not equally contain both immediacy and mediation. And given that he wrote this in the introduction to the logic, he obviously meant that it applied to the logic. So contra Holgate, and according to Hegel, the logic is not immediately given, but what is it mediated by? Hegel had answered this in the preface. It is in this way that I've tried to expound consciousness in the phenomenology of spirit. Consciousness is spirit as concrete knowing, a knowing too in which externality is involved. But the development of this object, like the development of all natural and spiritual life, rests solely on the nature of the pure essentialities which constitute the content of the logic. The pure essentialities of the process outlined in the phenomenology, the logic of that process, what is necessary rather than contingent or accidental or subjective. So Hegel has told us that the logic is the logic of the process described in the phenomenology of spirit, the development of all natural and spiritual life. The phenomenology of spirit is the preface to Hegel's system of philosophy, though he wrote it before completing the logic. It was an early work, and unlike the science of logic or the encyclopedic logic, it was never revised. It was not reprinted during his lifetime, and Hegel used to give copies away as gifts to friends. But it's a very clever and typically Hegelian way of writing a preface. It tells the story, the experience of consciousness as it comes to philosophy, and Hegelian philosophy in particular. It tells this story along three axes. It leads the reader through the journey schematically of how an individual, naive consciousness comes to a philosophical view of the world. And it tells the story of Western philosophy from its beginnings as Hegel saw it in the ancient Greeks. And it tells the story of consciousness through the history of forms of state. These are three objective manifestations of how the modern reader has arrived at the logic, in schematic form, of course, but as Hegel says, a process in which externality is involved. That is a real history that has been affected by contingency and can be empirically confirmed or disconfirmed. The only presupposition for the phenomenology is the existence of communities of natural human beings. But you see, if you have traveled that journey, if you have made the journey to philosophy, and you are familiar with the history of the sciences, art and literature of your community, if you're a person of the world who understands and participates in the affairs of the community in which you live, then you're in a position to understand the logic which is at work in these processes. And it is this which constitutes the content of the logic, according to Hegel. If you have the necessary life experience, then the transitions in the logic can make sense to you. But it is not the same as understanding what is actually going on there. Just like a fluent speaker of a language does not necessarily know the grammar or etymology of the language they are speaking. So the logic is not presuppositionless in this sense. Its presupposition is the existence of people who are products of the journey of spirit up to the present moment, and to a greater or lesser extent are at home in this medium. An educated public, in short, a public which does not simply take what is given to it, but which is critical and tries to get to the truth of things, strives for freedom. So you can see why Hegel's logic is the logic for social movements. As a first approximation, then, I will say that Hegel's logic is the logic of human activity. But I'm by no means alone in this claim. Walter Kaufmann, Charles Taylor, and Robert Pippin, all famous Hegelians, all agree that the logic is the logic of human activity. Pinkard and Brandom go a little further, and I'll mention their view presently. All well and good, but you'll see that the text of the logic, slightly less so the explanatory notes from Hegel's students, which have been inserted by his editors, has very little to say about history or politics and so on. The content is just abstract concepts like being and nothing, form and content, subject and object, and so forth. So how do we find this real human content in the logic of concepts? Now, Hegel's logic is a concept logic as opposed to a propositional logic. Logic also includes the formation of concepts as well as the development of concepts. Imagine a man who is arguing with his wife about sharing the housework. The man might say, housework is women's work, so you have to do it. From a formal logical point of view, he has argued quite correctly, but his concept of woman is crap. Gottlob Frege, the father of modern formal logic, entitled his major work, The Begriffsschrift, the concept script. But he also claimed to have written a concept logic. Frege is a huge advance over the formal logic, which Hegel knew 50 years before. But in reality, Frege's logic is also a formal propositional logic. I say this because Frege shared with the medieval logicians that a concept was a collection of the necessary and sufficient attributes of its object. This is not Hegel's view. All the logicians up to and including contemporary writers on the psychology or logic of concepts in our time concur on this understanding of the meaning of concept. They equate a primitive form of concept with a genuine concept, primitive in the sense of childlike or corresponding to the early stages of formation of a concept. Concepts which are not yet really concepts, pseudo-concepts, so to speak. For example, I might recognize Anthony Albanese by certain facial features. It would be wrong to say that the features by means of which I recognize him constitute a true concept of Anthony Albanese. And it will be doubly wrong to think that it is by recognizing such features I have the concept of Prime Minister, as a child might think, for example. This type of concept made up of necessary and sufficient features is called an abstract general concept. This is, of course, the logic of a certain kind of human activity. In the third book of the logic, you can read the story of how contradictions in formal thinking of this kind lead to genuine developed concept logic. And you find, in addition to the well-known syllogisms about Socrates being mortal, also an array of other similar-looking syllogisms which are patently wrong. But they are in fact types of reasoning which in reality we find all around us and which we are all guilty of ourselves sometimes when we have not quite yet grasped the nature of a situation or concept. How does Hegel elaborate a concept logic then? Basically, he tests a concept X by examining the claim X is absolute or everything is X. Just as you might examine a claim, it's all about the money. The claim that everything a person does is determined by financial gain. Each of these universal claims represents a certain kind of activity, a certain formation of consciousness or institution in which the given rule is the norm. Hegel then subjects this regime to critique. The process of critiquing the claim, everything is X. The process of criticizing a concept is to push the concept to its limits and beyond. We all do this to the institutions we work in, our governments and so on, and it leads to a new generalization. No, everything is really Y. X is just a special case or something of the kind. This is the form of movement we see in Hegel's logic. A succession of concepts arises through the process of critiquing a concept, showing its limits and taking it beyond those limits, showing that it is not absolute. It is the very process by means of which people learn, by means of which all the sciences advance, and the way in which laws and governments fall and are replaced by others. It is the logic of this process of living critique. When a concept comes under critique, Hegel refers to the outcome as the truth of the concept. If there is no critique, no struggle to go beyond the limits of a concept, a science or a law, then there is no movement, and the truth of the concept is never exposed. The process of critique entails digging out the contradictions which otherwise lay dormant in a concept. The skilled critic can do this, but even if there are no philosophers around, insofar as a natural living human beings are enacting a concept, there is an inevitable process which will do that work. Eventually, the truth will out. Sooner or later, some accident, some turn of events will expose a contradiction, and the concept is exposed, and everyone can see its truth. So long as people are struggling for freedom, all forms of activity are eventually pushed to their limit. The logic exhibits this process of critique. I'll present a lecture on the logic next week. For now, I'm just trying to introduce you to an ontology which makes Hegel's logic intelligible and useful. But you should know that this movement takes different forms in each of the books of Hegel's logic. So Hegel's Encyclopedia. In the first book, The Logic of Being, the form of movement is seriality. That is, a concept arises and passes away and has no more validity. It is then replaced by another, which in turn passes away, one damn thing after another, a transition from one to the next to the next. In the second book, which is called Essence, everything is relative. And in the passage from one relation to another, the former relation does not pass away, but remains, although pushed to the background. So the form of movement is diversity. In the third, the concept logic, the movement is no longer either a transition into or reflection on something else, but development, with each new relation incorporated into the concept and all the former relations merged with it. The vital force within this movement is the contradictions, which is successively exposed and resolved by critique. All well and good. You're getting the idea, I hope, of how the logic originates from human activity. But I still haven't explained what a concept is for Hegel, and I need to explain how a sane person can talk of concepts as if they were subjects. Terry Pinkard says that the subject matter of the phenomenology is formations of consciousness. What we understand by formations of consciousness are practices animated by a specific culture, a form of life. This includes religious orders, states, ethnic communities, scientific institutions, artistic movements, and so on. Pinkard makes the point that it's not so much what people involved in such a community do, which are important, as the reasons they give for what they do, and which characterize the formation. In general, all the specific reasons are special concepts of the self-concept of the entire community, just as the concepts of a science are all special concepts of one overarching concept of the science as a whole. Robert Brandom observes that philosophy, any philosophy, has for its subject matter norms rather than actual behavior. Institutions, practices, forms of activity are characterized by norms rather than just being collections of actual actions. I agree with both these authors, and I will make a second approximation to the answer to our question. The subject matter of Hegel's logic is the norms of human activity rather than the activity itself, which, as Hegel says, entails externality, is subject to accident and subjective whims, the norms of human activity. Now, following Robert Brandom again, there are three kinds of norm. Practical norms or norms of behavior, what people are expected to do in a given situation. Theoretical norms or norms of belief, such as a community's metaphysics or scientific beliefs. And semantic norms, the meaning people in the community take to be attached to a word or gesture or event and so on. All the sciences are like this. When Galileo rolled steel balls down an inclined plane and timed how long it took in each instance for the ball to roll a certain distance, and worked out the law governing its acceleration, he did not get the same result from every experiment. He understood that the law he was looking for was a kind of norm for balls rolling down a slope. He ignored the results when the experiment got messed up. He averaged the rest to eliminate random effects. It's the same in understanding human activity en masse. We don't try and explain every single action. We're just interested in the norm which is at work. Now, norms are funny things. They're not mental in the sense of being phenomena of introspection. They're not material either in the normal sense of the word. A spoken or written word is material, but the meaning of a word, the semantic norm, is something quite different. It's implicit in the way people use the word. But it is these norms which Hegel's referring to when he talks about thought. They can be quite material. A tool is a persistent norm of labor, according to Hegel, for example. For any individual, the norms, especially but not only if they are written in the criminal code and enforced by the police, have a material force. Concepts are in fact norms. The concept of a university, for example, entails a range of practices, people with certain skills and qualifications, certain relevant regulations, typical buildings such as libraries and lecture theatres and so on. And we expect people to act in a certain way. Academics expect to be paid, people go to libraries to find books, and so on. The concept of university entails a whole range of special concepts which represent expected behaviours, the meaning of various things, the status of certain people and their rights and so forth. So when we're talking about Hegel's logic being a concept logic, we can see that what this means is that it is the logic of norms of human practices, and that in particular, we understand the logic of these norms through the logic of conceptual norms. Conceptual norms, concepts, embrace all the kind of norms mentioned earlier, semantic, theoretical, and practical norms. But this still doesn't explain, for example, why Hegelians can talk about concepts as if they were subjects. Subjects which do things, have intention and volition. It still looks like some kind of mysticism. After all, norms are merely something which the keen observer can abstract from observation of human activity, and often the people participating in those activities would not even be aware of the relevant norms. They're just doing what they do. Further, we're still left with a generalization, the logic of human activity. This is still very vague, a useful tool for cultural criticism or lawmaking, perhaps rules for thinking, some people say, but we are still lacking a way of conceiving of human activity such that this logic of human activity can have some purchase. Why should a logic of concepts tell us anything beyond incidental insights about how people act outside of departments of philosophy and how? That's the topic of the next lecture.
Great, thanks, Andy. That was excellent. Like leading on from last week as well, I guess, like to put this in context, like I've been studying Hegel with Andy for 2 years now. And what I struggle with now is defending Hegel against like a lot of criticism of like, like reductionist of maybe he's just all about God and stuff like that. Anyway, this has been really helpful for building up the sort of rhetoric around that logic. And I think that's what's missing when you're often trying to describe Hegel, is being able to describe the logic and how the logic is involved in the analysis of Hegel itself. When you talked about concepts as norms, I felt that really hit home for me. When we talk about as social movement activists about making change, and we talked last week about idealism versus materialism, we talk about building systems, worker-owned systems, different ways of being, different ways of organizing, unions, etc. And in that, it changes the way that we think, as you're saying. And it's only because of the way that we've thought, because we've been in those things, and because we've thought those things over time, that we realize that those are strategies that we need to use and that work, and we can see them, we can analyze them in other situations how they work. I think that's the power of Hegel, and I think that's also why Hegel is often just like dismissed. Because if you get into the logic, then you start talking about then how the material systems that we have also then, like here and now, define the ideology that we live in. You know, like the old saying of, you know, the two fish going along in the water, and a big fish comes by and says, "How's the water, boys?" And the boys go, "What's water?" You know, like ideology is not something you know that you live in. And it's very important that people don't think that way. So that's why I think that it's really important. Like Hegel is stopped it being something that we think about as a logic. I'm rambling, I'm gonna shut up, but thank you. This has been really helpful.
Okay. Agree with everything you said. What you do as a social activist is you try and change the norms. So it's a manual. Hegel's logic's a manual for people who want to change the norms. Steve, you're next. Steve Chang.
Yeah, hi. You said that Hegel was said something about them. We'll cut all of this, and yeah, I'm just wondering if you could say more about what you think Hegel is trying to say on the relationship between freedom and truth.
There's an interpretation of Hegel which basically says all Hegel's about is freedom. Right, that's the whole drift of what he's writing about. He's tracing through the philosophy of nature and the subjective spirit, the objective spirit, you know, through the encyclopedia, the expansion of human freedom. And of course, his understanding of freedom is both positive and negative freedom. To say freedom from oppression and limitations on what you can do, and freedom to be able to learn and to develop your own projects and personality. But of course, he understands that requires, it's not an individual thing, it requires a total development of the way people live. You don't get freedom on your own. And he demonstrates this by showing how any existing social arrangement finds itself at a certain point in trouble. It comes across a contradiction for which it doesn't have the resources to solve. So, for example, someone ends up in court saying, "Hey, this law's come in, but I've been treated unjustly." Right? And you might even a whole campaign saying, "You've got to change this law because it's not doing what it's supposed to do. It's actually making life worse for the victims here." So then you have a sit around, judge passes something, people, you know, the politicians think, well, we better change the law here. And then the thing changes as a new norm, which affects how people treat each other in day-to-day life. What's the right thing to do and what's wrong? Judges make decisions accordingly, and so on. So it's finding the truth of things come out. You know, there can be a form of oppression going on, but it's not, it's invisible. But then, you know, things start happening. It comes to the surface, the contradiction, that's say, when I say oppression, where someone's suffering in a way that according to what the society thinks of itself, they shouldn't, right? But nevertheless, they are. So it's a contradiction, right? So it's bringing out the truth of the present situation, which forces it to change. Sometimes the change fails, you know, and actually get a worse situation. So the change isn't an automatic thing, but it breaks down an old formation and opens up the opportunity of a new one. Okay, Rachel.
Hi, Andy. We probably don't even, you don't even need to answer this right now. It might be coming up later or anything, but the discussion of norms, I noticed that it was just a blanket term, norm, that was being used, but you were describing what, to me, are quite different things, like norms of behavior are obviously one thing, but you have moral norms, legal norms. I just wanted to know whether or not the different sort of flavor of norms comes up at all, or whether in Hegel's logic we're just using this blanket norm.
Yeah, norm's not a word that Hegel uses. I don't ever remember him talking about norms. He somehow takes them for granted. He just expresses himself in different terms. Norms is a word I suppose I learned the idea of talking about norms from Robert Brandom, right? And then I looked at, because I've been trying to understand Hegel's logic in terms of it being a logic of practice. But then I didn't feel right about it, because I knew people can do anything, and how can you have a logic of that? And then when I read Brandom, not talking necessarily about interpretation of Hegel, but he makes this statement, all philosophy is about norms. And I think, of course, that's it. So among young activists and critical people, norm has, it's got negative connotations to it, because you're all fighting against existing norms, right? So you tend to see norms as bad things, but there's really good norms and bad norms, so to speak, to be really gross about it. There are norms that you definitely want to change, which are oppressive and wrong, but the object of overthrowing those norms is to bring in new norms which are not oppressive, right? So there are, of course, many kinds of norms, but I accepted Brandom's typology because, legal norms is it's a special case of norms for a particular type of practice. It's expected behavior in the legal profession. Moral norms is really a bit of a, going to put it, an unhappy term because of the connotations of moral today. But they're the norms of behavior. You don't shit in the street, right? That's like a moral norm, right? And I don't know of anyone that's trying to overthrow that norm, but it's a bit arbitrary, In different parts of the world, we might be quite happy to shit in the street, but we don't do that. And we drive down the left side of the road, not the right. Right? It's just the norm. It's how we live. No special thing about the left rather than the right, but that's what we do. And for a community to operate, norms are essential. You can change them, but the idea of semantic norms makes it obvious. If there's not some kind of agreed norm of the meaning of words, very broadly, right? If someone just starts using a word in a completely novel way that no one else has heard of, they won't be understood, right? So if you want to give a new meaning to a word, you have to do the work to explain it, right? And then you can change the norm and the word can take on a different meaning, right? But norms are essential part of how we live. The climate science is of course a norm of belief. It's and just as the law of gravity is. Okay, does that help at all? What I said, Rachel?
Yeah, I think when discussing legal norms and stuff, like I was actually more referring to like in the sort of almost scientific sense of like laws in and of themselves, like if we're talking about the concept of law or something, need to be passed within specific, depending on your state, depending on your constitution or your parliamentary system or whatever. You have a specific mechanism by which legal norms are created, which do not necessarily align with social norms or moral norms of any given society.
Sorry,
I was just wondering whether or not.
I didn't understand that, what you're saying. People talk about legal norms in a different sense. Yes, look, norms are not necessarily passed in legislation. And sometimes the law says you should do is completely out of whack with how people actually live. And that's a contradiction, right? The law says, I won't try and improvise something, but the law will say you absolutely have to do X, and there's a penalty for not doing it. But like smoking marijuana and things, according to the law, it's illegal. Everyone does it, and the police don't even bother to enforce it. Now that's a contradiction. Something's got to blow at some point. But the idea of norm, the idea of a norm isn't a rigid thing. It includes norms which are just emergent. Others which are strong but not yet given the black letter formulation, others which are written into law, laws which have gone out of date. They're written into law, but they're not obeyed. But so it's not a cut and dry thing. But what you're talking about with norms is the way people are expected to behave, and that may differ from what's written down. Okay, Ryan.
Thanks, Andy. I was just wondering, you mentioned, maybe you answered this a bit in your response to Steve's question, but you mentioned contradictions in the concept. And then you also sort of gave an example of, say, in the justice system, like contradictions between like practice and the ideal of justice. Can you maybe say what is the nature of the contradictions, or how do contradictions appear in the concept, and how would one understand them, per se? Hegel. Thanks.
Okay. Going to put it. A contradiction, there can be different manifestations of contradictions, and I'm sort of overwhelmed with the different ways people explain it. Pain is existent contradiction. I think Marx said that somewhere, or maybe it was Hegel. When there's a general conception or intent or self-consciousness of some norm, but what results is something different. So, for instance, at some point or other, some legislation passed a law saying murder is wrong, and it's got a serious penalty on it, right? But they didn't bother to elaborate on that. And then someone says, "Excuse me, sir, but I was in the army, and of course I had to kill people because that was my duty." And say, "Oh, right, yes, we didn't mean that. If you're doing it in the service of the army, you're allowed." "Oh, but sir, he was in the army, but that was one of us he killed." "Oh, yes, sorry. No, soldiers are only allowed to kill the enemy. But he was a prisoner." "Oh, yeah, only allowed to kill the enemy." You know what I mean? What you find is that the basic idea behind a norm continually proves inadequate to its definition. And that's why, a good parliament spends, months and weeks, year after year, passing more and more laws, particularly as the scope of human activity expands. We keep doing things that people hadn't thought of before. Laws continually fail to achieve what their basic intent was. So I don't know if that's a definition of a contradiction, but it's a classic example of one, right? To get the idea of it really is that's the benefit of reading Hegel for yourself, because it takes you through more than 200 of these little transitions where one concept falls apart and has to be overtaken by another, right? So they can happen in all sorts of ways. I talk about pushing concepts beyond their limit. So you say, this idea is this kind of thing. So you draw a boundary around it. You say, "Oh, so what about the other side of the boundary?" "Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a different thing." So that was poorly explained once. I'm sorry. I hope that'll have to do for the moment, Ryan. Maybe it will become clear as we continue talking.
Yep, thanks.
Abet, thank you. What have you got to say?
Okay. With regards to that word again, norms. The way I understood it is that they refer to certain powers, tendencies, liabilities inherent in things. And that's what I got from that part of your lecture with Galileo doing that ball thing, and it's not always doing what it's expected to do, but there's a general tendency towards that thing, and that is how I understand both these ideas of norms. I guess I got this from a different source, particularly the social ontology of the likes of Roy Bhaskar, where it basically relates the idea of experimentation. Why do we do it? What are we actually doing? We're not actually looking for events. We're trying to isolate things in the natural science in order to look for these things. So the events themselves are not, they reveal the natural laws or norms, but unlike the positivists, the existence of that, of those observable events, they are not the law itself. So it's something like that. Which actually brought me to trying to understand Hegel, and that illustration with the ball, and it's not always going to become, it's not always going to run in the same velocity, or because maybe you use a different surface for the other, but you are looking for those tendencies. Now, if that's say in the natural world, where let's just assume for the sake of discussion that in the natural world, these norms, these tendencies are relatively enduring. But in the social world, because we actually can change these things, they are only relatively enduring. So
it's our second nature, but it's our second nature. We can change it.
Yeah, and that's why, again, particularly at the start of the discussion, before you started the lecture, about Marx and Hegel, 25 years apart, and things are already very different, than us 100 years apart, even more different. It's precisely because of that, because the norms have changed. And these norms, they are like tendencies. They do not manipulate us directly into doing stuff. We have the ability to react back to it, but it has that tendency.
I think the word expectation is a powerful one, because we know that if everyone is expecting you to do X, it's difficult to do not X, because there's that power of expectation. Now, even if there's no particular sanction, they're going to jump on you if you don't do X, but people are expecting you. So that's the way. The norm doesn't exist so much in the object, which is carrying out the norm, but it exists in the mind of those who have expectations on it, right?
Yeah,
and that produces itself, because if we have expectations, on the whole, people tend to go along those expectations and they reflect them back to us.
Yeah, and in the spirit of that monist idea, it's not that these are thoughts and actions are things in different dimensions connected by some sort of mysticism. That's not it. It's that these are all dimensions of the same thing. But but the elements of these dimensions are susceptible to change, particularly when we talk about social structures. Unlike when we talk about, say, the law of gravity, how long do plants live, and things in the natural world, where these norms have some sort of relative durability that social norms do not. That's,
exactly.
I guess, the distinctions. Thank you.
Matthew.
Sorry, just had to find the mute button. Thanks again for that, Andy. Might be a banal point, but when you were talking about having an underlying norm for the definition of a word, it struck me a little bit of my sort of understanding of some of the arguments that Wittgenstein is making, or at least my very baby understanding of what Wittgenstein is saying, that I can have a concept of cat in my head, and you can have a concept of what a cat is in your head, and it doesn't have to be the exact same, matching ideal of what a cat is for us to be able to, talk about cats in general with each other. That again, like inside our head, we've got our own sort of specific definitions of words that may differ in small or large ways with other people, but we can still communicate.
The problem I have with Wittgenstein is he likes to talk about words and their variety of meanings, and like to examine that, but he never talks about concepts. Or when he talks about concepts, he does so in a matter-of-fact way, as if it's something everybody knows. But the thing is, there's a concept of cat, and all of this would be impossible unless centuries ago people started domesticating these wild felines and introducing them into human, activity and so on. So there is a concept of a cat, and that all the things we say and the different ideas about cats and the different way we use the word, like you talk about someone being a real pussycat, right? You don't mean a cat, but Wittgenstein would love that, but there's still a concept behind it. And I think it was one of the negatives. It's why, although Wittgenstein was, he was a critic of logical positivism, but to me, he still really remains a logical positivist. Yeah, he criticized it, but because he wouldn't actually face what is the actual material basis of a concept, what is a concept, actually he would have the same answer as Frege or anyone else. It's a collection of attributes, and then he'd show how silly it is that we use words in this way when a game can be, mean so many different things, for example.
Well, I guess my question was whether, maybe it's a banal, as I said, maybe it's a banal point, but whether even people having different ideas of what the same concept is a point of tension or contradiction that might lead to change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For instance, a university doesn't mean the same thing to an academic as it does to the cleaner. I'll tell you that because I was a general staff member in a university for many years, and their concept of a university is very different from that of the academics. But that's all in the concept of university. It isn't just one thing that's defined in some book or something. All the different social positions from which someone, for which the entity has meaning, the concept has meaning for someone, is part of that concept. Yeah, so what we're trying to do here is to develop understanding of concepts, which is really concrete. Yeah, they're not abstract definitions and so on, but where things have different meaning for different people. And that's so that we can understand those internal contradictions and they're meaningful. Yeah. Tom.
Hi, I just wondered if you could maybe further explain one of the lines, I think in the first paragraph of the what is a concept section. You say, as the concepts of a science are all special concepts of one overarching concept of the sciences as a whole. I wonder if you could, something about the relationship between all the different particular ideas and the universal general conception. Is the universal one just the totality of the general ones, or what's the?
Well, no, I think the general concept of a whole is what determines and controls the minor concepts. Now, I was illustrating that with the concept of university. So if you have a concept of a university, then a lecture theatre is meaningful, right? If there weren't universities, people would probably think of a classroom or a boardroom or something. But when we think of a university, we're thinking of hundreds of lectures, students. We're thinking of a lecturer standing up the front and delivering wisdom to hundreds of people. And a library has a different meaning as a part of a university. It's different from a public library with a very general collections. And someone can be an academic, but when we talk about someone being an academic, we do so because it's a part of the concept of a university, because academic is a certain category of worker in a university, right? So let's say you take science. Science, I would say, is the practice of making, I'm going to put it, acting according to evidence. So, I'm not going to live and die by that. That's an improvised definition of science. So all the sciences are obliged to develop their practices according to evidence. Otherwise, they're not going to be science. It's going to be sport or religion or something, right? Given, can I put it, socialism, right? There's an overarching concept of being a socialist. And now there'll be argument about that. Some people think it's the concept of some distant future country or utopia, where everyone's equal or something, right? I think that's a poor concept of socialism. I see socialism is the principle of solidarity. If you're a socialist and you practice solidarity, you support others who are fighting, and you look forward, of course, to a world in which solidarity is a universal principle. So you can go through different sort of major concepts which represent a whole sort of field of life or something. And then if you've understood that correctly, there'll be all sort of special definitions of that. Like, so if you're the concept of unionism, I suppose it's solidarity between employees, right? Sticking up for each other as an employee. But the teachers' union and the plumbers' union are sort of very different unions. And you know that, right? Any plumber that sort of gives up plumbing and becomes a teacher will have to adjust their idea about what it means to be a member of the union, and so on and so forth, right? It means something different for the employer, for whom the union is just obstruction for what they want to do, maybe, right? So does that help?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Good. According to Hegel, when there is a contradiction, contradictions arise continuously. And his view is that think of like a court of appeal that you go to when a contradiction arises. And every social formation has a kind of final court of appeal, right? In our world, I think the final court of appeal is capital accumulation. If you can't accumulate capital, then this whole system is threatened. So he says that when the contradiction makes its way up through the existing concept and is resolved according to the self-understanding of that concept, the reasons people give for what they do, citing, what Pinkard said, at a certain point, you get to this sort of final court of appeal. And if that can't resolve it, a contradiction arises which the community has no answer to, then it's in danger of collapsing and giving away to something else, right? That's a broad sort of historical view of that. I don't necessarily say it's right, but that's you can see where he's coming from.